So if you notice, the way I give a talk is in a conversation with you. So you guys already had a lot of chances to ask me questions. Kurt has a degree in theology and has actually done a lot of work on New Testament stuff. For those of you who know me, you know that I talk about Jesus a lot. I talk about the evidence for the resurrection. He actually is one of the people who has actually maybe actual training in this too. So that's a good thing to talk about. And happy to take any questions you guys have too.
Yeah. Now we've got some questions from yesterday.
Okay.
Are those are on a PowerPoint? Okay. So there's the question. I have not seen these questions, and of course neither has Josh. So how do we know if we are hearing from God? How do we know it's not another spirit or Satan? This is where the theologian in me has some interesting questions like, what does it mean to hear from God? What are the ways that God speaks to us? There maybe for some of us are different ways. For some people, God speaks audibly. Hugh Ross, who runs Reasons to Believe, says that he's had a miraculous encounter with God and that God spoke to him audibly. He heard God speak. That's not the way it is for everyone, certainly not for me. And one of the things I like to tell people is that when we read the Bible, when we read the scriptures, we see some of the most famous characters in the story, in the grand meta-narrative. Moses, for example. He's such an important figure, right? What was he doing before God appeared to him in the form of the burning bush? Anyone know what Moses was doing? He was shepherding sheep. Does anybody know how old Moses was?
80.
It's something like 60 or 80 years old. I mean, old. So here we are, some of us, we might feel like, man, we're just lonely because we don't hear audibly from God. Well, I mean, we aren't told that God communicated in an audible form or fashion with Moses until much later in life. And even then, Moses had a very important role to play in the course of Historia Salutis, the history of salvation. Many of us have our part to play, but we're not all Moses. If everyone were like Moses, then there would be no one to lead, because everyone would be leaders. So I like to remind people that we all have different parts to play. There were people to build the tabernacle, and there's good value in having those roles. But God speaks to us in different ways. He speaks to us through His Word. When we read the text, the inspired text, God speaks to us. We learn something there. I'll even go something that may make some of you feel uncomfortable. God speaks to us through other forms as well, like when we watch a powerful movie, we learn transcendental truths, right? Those truths are true, regardless of whether they were formed from a Christian filmmaker or not. If something is true of the world, right, this is the world that God created. And so we're here to discover those truths. So we might find God speaking to us in other ways, in our relationships, for example. We learn more about ourselves. At least for me, I learn more about my faults. But God can speak to us in that way, and it can be very refining for us. We recognize these challenges, these interpersonal challenges, and God speaks to us through that way, through learning as well. So, I used to think that, man, if I didn't hear God speak to me, maybe similar to Dante's story, that, God's just not there, or He doesn't care. And the more I realized I had a faulty view, or what I take to be a faulty view, of how humans relate to God. And as I began to study and think more and realize, oh yeah, God does speak, but He speaks in different ways, then there was sort of a gray cloud that left from hanging over me. Because all of a sudden I was finding ways in which God was speaking to me in ways that popular Christianity never really sort of described. One more analogy, and then Josh, I'd love to get your thoughts. Ambassadors. When an ambassador goes to speak to a royal of a foreign nation, the ambassador, whatever the ambassador says in that official capacity, the ambassador speaks on behalf of the President of the United States. So in that same way, for example, the prophets spoke the words of God. They were ambassadors in that regard. And in that sense, too, God speaks. God can speak through other people. And it doesn't have to be a direct, audible voice. After all, God is immaterial. And what does it mean to hear? I mean, we're talking about sound waves. So how does all of that work? So I can think, from a naturalistic sort of perspective, there should be an explanation. It doesn't degrade any sort of miraculous occurrence that happens or its divine origin. But there would be a natural way of understanding how those sorts of things work. And I think that plays into certain miracles in the Old Testament. For example, Balaam's donkey. That's an interesting one to think about. At any rate, I'm going on a rabbit trail. Josh, I'd love to get your thoughts on this question.
I think it's actually a very practical question, especially as we talk about the stage you're at. You guys are getting prepared for going to the university and to college, right? It's going to be, once again, this diversity. How do you figure out how much is, I think, to make it in a very practical sense, how do you tell when you're talking to someone else whether or not they are repeating a lie that they got from the world, or if they're actually correcting a lie that you got from the world? How do you know what the truth is? How do you know what the bad influences are and what are the good influences? Does that make sense? I think that's what the question is, right? A huge part of it. Even all these influences, you can see there's truth in a movie, but what of that is actually truth and what of it is a lie? That's a discernment question that's really hard. What I'd say is two things. One is Scripture actually talks about this. It says that we need to exercise discernment. And 1 John 1 is important. It says, or 1 John says that basically we're to test the spirits by asking questions. And the one that it said there was to, do you actually believe that Jesus came and rose again in the flesh? And so in the very focused sense, you can really have clarity about where people stand with Christ in a different way by asking them specifically what they believe about the resurrection. And then ask them about lordship. And also ask them how they're connecting these things together with the ideas they have. And you want to ask questions to understand. So I think questions is a really helpful way to start piecing together that. And then the last thing is just to think, I guess very much aligned with this is exactly what you'd expect from the blind man story. If you have a bunch of blind men that are sitting there and you can't tell which one is actually, has the picture where their account is true, where it's not, where it ends, whatever. The only way to solve this is if you sit down and actually start talking to one another. And the thing about how it works is that cults, things that are counterfeits, things that are not true, they all pale in comparison to the truth of who Jesus is. He's good. And the way how that works then is how do you actually protect something that's false from the truth? You try and isolate it and keep it away from conversation. And so when you actually bring it into conversation with other people, that actually can really very quickly bring to light what is true and what is false. And that's why we can't actually even do it alone. And that's actually why we want to be subjecting ourselves even to that type of discourse as well.
I'd also say, too, don't be afraid to talk about sin. You brought up 1 John. Those who say they are without sin lie and they don't have the truth, John tells us. So especially if you're going off to college and you're meeting people who basically think that they can do no wrong. It's unfortunate, and you can see people like that who struggle. You can see what issues they may be dealing with, but they're unwilling to call them out in their own life. That's one of the differentiations, I think, between a Christian who's a disciple of Jesus and just someone who self-identifies as a Christian. That's a big marker there. The question, so to follow up there, how do we know it's not another spirit or Satan?
Well, we want to make sure we get to other questions, right?
That's true.
Yeah, so let's see what the next question is. We don't want to spend too much time. We should probably try and give quicker answers, too. I don't know. Up to you, though. Could too much exposure to Christian truths and values cause people to reject them? What do you want to say, Kurt? Or do you want me to try and answer?
Well, there are many reasons why people reject truths or interpretations of truths, and so that's a very complex question.
I would say that. Look, I think what I'd say is some of the people you're going to find that are most anti-Christians are the ones that were most sheltered in a Christian context when they were younger. There's many different types of atheists out there. I actually have a lot of atheists that are friends. Did you know that God loves atheists too? And atheists are actually pretty nice people generally. I know it's amazing, but it's true. And I hope you have some friends that are atheists. But regardless, what's interesting is the ones that, there are many atheists that are raised atheists by atheist families. They tend to actually not even be typically that anti-religious. The ones that are most anti-Christian are the ones that were raised Christian. And even atheists talk about this fact. So what's going on with that? I think part of what's going on is that, if we have a very busheled faith that's kind of hidden under a bushel and it's protected from the world, it actually becomes ingrown and it doesn't actually become what it's designed to be. It's really similar to what we were just talking about before about the idea of, well, some of you weren't here for this. We were talking about the church in China, where it's Christians in a world that's not controlled by Christians, where everyone goes to public school where they teach atheistic evolution, not even just evolution, but atheistic evolution. Christians don't have power. It's not a Christian society, but somehow they don't have quite the same problems that are more common, for example, among some, not all, young Earth creationist homeschool kids when they go out into the real world. And what's going on with that? It just turns out that our faith doesn't actually do best when it's busheled, when it has like something over it. It actually does better when it's out in the real world. And so I wouldn't say it's so much, it's not precisely too much exposure to Christian truths and values as much as
not being exposed enough.
Yeah, not being exposed enough to other things. I mean, I think what we find out is that if you encounter Jesus, he's good. And we find out that if we really encounter the world and Jesus, that Jesus is greater than anything we find there. But if you never encounter the world, maybe you'll doubt that. Maybe you won't know. Maybe you'll get confused by other things. And if Jesus needs to be protected and Christianity needs to be protected, that's what people who are weak do. They protect themselves. But what we find out from Jesus is that he laid down power. He entered the world. He took on the burden and the suffering of the world because there was a confidence in what he had and a power in laying down power. And so I think it's actually very hard to have to follow Jesus, to fully understand him, until we engage the world. I was raised in a young Earth creationist household. I went to a Christian school growing up. It wasn't homeschooling. And there were certain points in my life during elementary school and junior high, I couldn't even identify any non-Christian I knew. Hopefully you're better than me. I mean, you guys aren't probably sheltered as I was because you have the internet. It makes it a little bit harder for your parents to control you.
You won't believe how many of these people are on TikTok.
I believe it. So you're probably exposed to stuff that I didn't get exposed to later. And I remember, though, like there's a lot of stuff about the church that just didn't make any sense. It was senseless to me. I mean, I don't want to get into details. I'm not trying to, criticize or attack, but there's just so much stuff that didn't make sense until I actually entered a secular high school and started to actually spend time with non-Christians. I mean, just think about it. So much about the scripture is about go tell people about the good news, witness your faith, but if you don't know any non-Christians, what the heck does that even mean? It just has no meaning. And this is somehow supposed to be a critical step of discipleship, but it has no meaning in that really sheltered place. And what you find out is our faith is defined by its fact that we're in the world but not of it. We're not separated from the world, we're in it but not of it. We're supposed to be a faithful presence in a world that isn't controlled by us. We're supposed to be like Daniel in Babylon. And Daniel did not like hole himself away in a little corner. He actually went out and served the good of the city. And it's kind of in that context where we actually encounter the living God, the one that doesn't need protection. He's not in, he isn't in the cat kennel. He isn't in our living room. I mean, well, he is everywhere. But he's not just there is the point. He's the wild, untamed lion. And I think you see that and experience that as you get away from that type of controlled Christianity and move into like the uncontrolled places where you don't have power, people you trust don't have power, people you agree with don't have power, and you find out that God still makes sense there.
All right, next question.
Do you guys want to meet that type of God and experience that? Wouldn't that be great? I'm just letting you know it's really out there.
Are guardian angels real?
There's a debate about that one too.
There is, yeah.
I don't know. Do you?
Well,
I'm okay saying I don't know about that one. I mean,
the book of Daniel, I mentioned this yesterday in my talk. The book of Daniel talks about an angel being delayed and then coming.
But that means that it's not a guardian angel, because guardian angel is supposed to be there's like a one for each one of us. So I actually think that's not likely. I think it's more kind of like the story you get more of is that there's like another realm in which they're off doing things, and God at times hasn't interacted with us.
Yep. That's kind of what I said yesterday, too, yeah.
But
There's
that's
just a lot we don't know that's going on.
So that's not quite a guardian angel.
Fair. Yeah.
In
Not
the
like
way-
someone who's constantly protecting you.
Yeah, there's like a Brazilian movie, thing that came out recently on, it's like a TV show that got translated in English in Netflix. But it actually has the idea of guardian angels. They all have red hair, apparently.
Huh.
And and there's one for every single person. And they're all just protecting you from physical harm and all that. I don't think that's real. It's more kind of like they're off about their business. And if we ever encountered them, our first reaction would be terror.
Yeah, in the New Testament, you see that where the disciples, fall down because they think these are.
On the other hand, though, there's this whole idea. Well, this is actually an interesting point too, where I guess that isn't always the reaction. So another reaction is that you just think they're another person. Like, so you have the 3 people who are taken in Sodom, right?
Yeah.
And where it's just like, oh, they're one of us, and you wouldn't notice. So I don't know.
Messengers.
Yeah, messengers.
That's what an angel is. Yeah, messenger. All right.
Next
So that
question.
kind of answers the question, but kind of not.
Next question.
Mm.
God should be understood. Well, I think it's a paradox. I think that he wants to be understood. We will understand something, but we're never going to understand fully. And that's not like a cop-out. Look, I'm married right now. I've been married for years. I understand things about my wife. I do not understand her in totality. She's a moving target. And so if I can't even understand a finite human, I'm pretty sure I'm never going to fully understand God. Yeah. That's actually what makes relationships so interesting. There's like an indeterminacy. As well as I know a person, I don't know what's going to happen in the next conversation I have. I mean, I might guess, but then they might surprise me. And there's something, in that sense, infinite about every relationship, where it just does. You can't fully know a person, but you can know them. And so I think that's what's going on with God. Yeah, we should know God. You should understand him, but you're never going to fully know and understand him.
And even those doctrines where we want to go really deep to try to understand, the more you learn, the less certainty frequently you have, because you see how difficult it can be to understand God on a certain, especially non-essential Christian doctrine.
Yeah, and I'd say that, there's a Lutheran in the room, a Lutheran pastor, Kirk Clayton. I'm not Lutheran, but I think I've learned a lot from them where they really emphasize paradox. I think this is actually a really helpful way to think through disagreement as well. Often what's going on, take the free will, God's sovereignty debate. What's going on actually is there are scriptures that do seem to teach free will, and there are scriptures, or like the legitimacy of actual choices, and there are scriptures that seem to teach God's sovereignty over all things. And there's almost like different ways of describing the same thing at times, and there's a tension.
Yeah, and both sides, well, I think it breaks down into a false dichotomy, but traditionally, the two sides want to take credit for all the verses, No one wants to just ignore those verses.
And I think a lot of these big, grand debates, often what's going on is there's a tension. There's a tension between things that are not actually fully false on either side. Really, maybe the falsity is trying to take a total view on one other end of it. There's some way we have to take a hold of both. Maybe we can get a clearer way to do that in a logical way. Maybe we can't. Maybe we can kind of sometimes say, well, I know there's some truth over here, and I know there's some truth over here, and I don't know how it fits together. And I can live in that uncertainty because I know I don't understand everything.
Yeah, good.
Next one. The Bible says we're covered by grace, but it also says that we keep on sinning, we do not know him. How does this work? Well, you can be covered by grace if we don't know him too. These are different things. It doesn't say you're covered by grace and therefore we don't know him. It's saying there's several ways to read that, but I'm telling you, just straight out, it says that we're covered by grace, but that doesn't mean we can't sin. And if we sin, there's something that we're not knowing about God.
Yeah, again,
Do you agree with that? It doesn't mean we're not covered by grace. It just means that.
That's fair, yeah. And this debate can go deeper into the different camps about what that all looks like. But at minimum, I think it would mean something like you're not in a right relationship with God.
But let's just be clear. Every Christian I know keeps on sinning. Even him. He's a sinner. You're a sinner. Hey, this is a little hard to say. I'm a sinner too. Okay? I'm being sanctified. Did you catch the being?
So presumably, if I can push you on this, there's progress being made, though, right? So there's not like
there's progress backwards often. Let's just be clear here. Look, part of me being a sinner is that I encounter the living God, I see him, and then I turn away and worship man-made idols. I'm like a living sacrifice that gets on that altar, and then I crawl off of it. I'm just telling you, there's this back and forth thing. Like I cast down my crowns, and then I pick them up so I can cast them out again. It's not like there's a continual progress in a certain direction.
Well, you'd hope it'd be like the stock market,
you would hope.
Where it's slowly going up.
You would certainly hope that way, but let's be serious here. That Christians are not that great. I mean, we'd like to think that we're better off with God, and I think actually we are, but that's by faith, because I don't have a good controlled experiment on that. Sometimes we see ourselves doing better over time, but sometimes we see ourselves doing worse over time.
Yeah.
And the fact of the matter is that we declare our lordship in Christ, and then we rebel against that lordship. And, even when you're turning away from God, and you're doing horrible things that are going to have long-term consequences in your life, and that are going to break relationships, I just want you to know that God loves you. And his grace covers you. Like, it's not actually about what you do in that way. And some of you, you're all the good kids in some ways. At least you're at least giving that impression now. Maybe you're a good actor, but I'll tell you what, some of you are going to do some things that right now you would not believe you would even do when you go to college. And you might even walk away from a time. It might not be positive progress, Kurt. Isn't that right?
In that season. I'm saying in the long term.
That season might be for a long period of your life.
Could be. Yes, that's right.
It might be many seasons. I just want you to know that, this is important for me to tell you. Like, it's not actually about how faithful you are at following Jesus. He loves you anyways. He wants you. He desires you. You can't do anything that will break his love for you. And his grace does cover you. He wants you. Now, it's up to him to decide what happens in the grand scheme of things. I'm not going to tell you about the rules of getting to heaven. He can figure that out. I'm not going to tell you about stuff, but he loves you, and his grace covers you. He wants to be in a relationship. Whatever you do, you even go out and deny him, he wants you. Did you know that? And so, we can take ourselves out of a relationship with God. That's, I think, what it's saying is, like, if you're sinning, you're, at least in that moment, you're not knowing something about Christ, but he might know you still.
So the story of the prodigal son, I think it's mainly about corporate groups, but we frequently apply it, and we find ways to understand our relationship. There are two sons in the family. There's an older son, or an elder, right? And there's the younger. And what happens? Well, the younger son comes to the father and asks for his inheritance, which is basically like saying, hey, I wish you were dead so I could have your value. So the father says, okay, gives it to the son. What does the son do with it? Runs away to a foreign land, squanders it, the life of sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
I thought it was pigs and pig food, but whatever.
Well, yeah. Modern take. And what happens is the son realizes, after finding no meaning in what he was doing, he decides to return home. He says, even if I were one of my father's servants, I would have a better life than what I've done here. And what do you read in the story? What happens? The father is looking off in the distance and sees his son returning home. And he, Dante, what's the Hebrew thing where they hike up the skirts? Yeah, I forget what the term was. What's that? Girdle, right? The long, I forget the
He
term.
just runs out to him. He gives him a big hug.
Yeah, that's right. He runs out to him. All right. And he just embraces him. And he says, we're going to have a feast. And what happens during this time? The older son hears of his younger brother's return, and he gets a little jealous. He says, hey, why are you throwing a feast with the largest cow for this guy who just squandered his inheritance? And what does the father tell the elder son? Everything I have is yours. So for both sons, they're covered in grace. Maybe you identify more as the elder son, but you're covered in grace in the same way as the prodigal son, right? The son that returns. So the son kept on sinning, but he was still covered in grace, even when he returned. So when you say, Josh, rightly, that Jesus loves you, where you're at, he wants to be in a relationship with you. That's the Father's love appearing there.
I'd also point out, too, is that sometimes we make the focus too much on ourselves. It says that we don't know him, and I think that's right. It says that we don't know him. But actually, when you look at the parable of the sheep and the goats, what it says is that it's not actually about whether or not the sheep know God or the goats know God. It's about whether or not, even some of the goats claim to know Jesus.
Yeah.
It's actually if Jesus knows them. And I don't think he's meaning knows of their existence, but, does he see himself as in a relationship with you? So it's actually not about how you see yourself with Jesus. This is a crazy thought. It's about how Jesus sees himself in a relationship with you.
Yep.
Now, that it just completely transforms the situation where what it means is that sinning, like this idea of continual rebellious sin, is more of a statement about who we are than it is about how we know Jesus than it is about how he knows us or what's going to happen in our future. God's grace can still cover us. We don't know what the future holds in all of those details. What I can tell you is that you are loved by God, and you should follow him. You should follow him not because there's a grand punishment or reward if you do or don't, per se. Well, maybe there is a reward. The reward is that, I'm just telling you, there's something grand about walking with Aslan. There's something grand about engaging the reality of this world with the untamed lion. Follow him. He's good, right?
Yep.
I'll tell you, one thing, I was in a very cloistered environment. A lot about the church didn't make sense, but one thing did make sense was Jesus. As you learn more about the world, maybe even already, there's a lot of stuff that just doesn't make sense about your family, about your church, about your education, your life, whatever. Fix your eyes on Jesus. He's the one that actually makes sense. Actually study more about him. Even if, you can't even trust all of the Bible, look at who he is. He's the one who makes sense of all of it.
Let's keep moving along for the questions here. We jumped from 5 to 8. I don't know how that worked, but...
Belief in God is so natural. Why are there so many atheists? Well, actually, it doesn't say that. It says that idolatry is natural. So I'm not really sure what that means to say that.
Maybe they're asking if the existence of God is so plain, why is it that there are people who don't believe? Why are there so many atheists?
Well, I would say there's many types of atheists, to be clear.
Also, and if we're looking at the course of human population here, the amount of atheists are just like a sliver compared to
Yeah,
people.
so one of the largest growing groups is called nuns, who often in the past would identify as atheists. If you kind of pushed and shoved, they'd probably say, well, I don't know, there's a God out there, but probably not. So they would actually kind of be soft atheists. It's actually fairly common. I just tell you is that they're actually a very complex group. I have a lot of atheists that are friends. There's 7 archetypes that I found for different types of atheists. It's really worth understanding and finding out. You'll find out that some of them have really good philosophical reasons for doubting man-made gods that, frankly, I would agree with. When they look around at religion, it all looks man-made. So it all looks man-made. They're all not. All of them have theological reasons that they're working through. If God exists, why isn't he actually telling me? I'll tell you, there's a good number of them. Some of them will probably be your friends. That they become atheists because they see real abuse and absurdity in the church and can't be associated with it. And to be honest, I have a hard time faulting them for that. Because there is some I'm about to say a bad word, and I'm going to hold off because this is a Christian environment, but there's some pretty effed up stuff that happens in the church, right? And frankly, if I hadn't encountered Jesus, I would be an atheist. Atheism is pretty dang reasonable. I just encountered someone who made that impossible for me. I saw something. What I tell atheists often is they kind of wonder why I'm a Christian and a scientist, and I tell them, hey, it's not that we, think about evidence differently or have different types of logic or whatever. I think the real difference, I even agree with you on evolution, and I think all that stuff you're talking about in the church is crazy too. And frankly, I'd be an atheist too, except for one thing. I encountered something. I saw something. I encountered Jesus. That changes things, and I found out that he was good, and I found out that he wants to be known, and I'm following him. That's the thing that makes it different. And they look at me and they say, okay, I haven't encountered that yet, but I can respect and understand that at least. And they ask questions they want to know. And I would just say that, I mean, it's an interesting question, honestly. I think atheists are also kind of made out to be, well, they're vilified. They're the villains in a lot of Christian stories. But honestly, atheists can be very honest, good people. I have so many atheist friends, to be honest. I love them.
I think it is very important to recognize that atheists are not the enemy, because Jesus died for them too.
And their belief structure isn't threatening either. It's actually not a bad belief structure. They just haven't encountered Jesus yet.
Yeah, I would say maybe it's something like a lost belief structure. I think they're missing out. I think atheists, generally speaking.
And I tell you, the ones that are the most
out on
anti-Christian, not all the time, and I don't want to psychologize, but some of them that are most aggressive have had the most abusive relationships with religion, where they were
burned by people in the church.
Rather than seeing them as like a threat that's attacking us, the starting point should be trying to figure out what's actually behind all that emotion and really being open to the idea that maybe Christians have done them real harm.
Yeah, and that gets to something I talked about yesterday with the relational problem of evil, right? The way we might interact and engage with people who don't believe is going to depend upon where they're coming from, what their life experience has been like. They might not be looking for stock answers, and frequently if they're the types that have been burned, they're going to recognize those stock answers, right? Oh, just read your Bible. Well, they've already have doubted its reliability, so why should they even give any credit to that?
Yeah, and with this too, like I'm telling you, like a big part of the transition you're in the middle of is the transition to adulthood, okay? It would be hard even if you weren't Christian. You guys understand that, right? Even if you weren't homeschooled, it's hard for everyone in today's world, all right? And they've done surveys, once again, and studies on why it is that people leave the faith. The purpose of this isn't to keep you in the faith. That's not the point. Because, if you encounter Jesus, you're going to stay here. But they've done studies, and one of the most common reasons that comes up for your peers, the people like a few years ahead of you, is they'll say, the reason why I left is because I was in a place where questions weren't allowed. Because all I was given was answers, I started to really question those answers weren't enough, and questions weren't tolerated. And so I left. And I want you to know that, first of all, that's a real thing that happens. A lot of churches are really bad with questions. A lot of families are really bad with questions. A lot of people, or Christians, are really bad with questions, all right? However, our faith, what I found in Jesus, what I found in Scripture, what I found in the grand church with a capital C, what I found in the historical Christianity, it thrives on questions. That's actually the fun of it. It is not actually about answers. We're actually supposed to sit up there, and maybe we were just wrong about guardian angels, for example. Maybe actually there's a guardian angel invisibly right there chuckling at you for saying something stupid, and there's another one up here chuckling at me for saying something stupid, because look at all these dumb people. And you know what? It doesn't actually matter. Part of the joy of the church is being able to be wrong on these things and to work about it and kind of bat it back and forth. And the questions are actually where the focus should be more than the answers.
Maybe you guys will ever get a chance to read Thomas Aquinas. He asks a lot of questions. Provides multiple answers, but he also asks a lot of questions. All right, next question. And we've only got 9 minutes here. Why doesn't God give everyone a definite sign that he's there?
He did, by raising this man Jesus from the dead.
Come on!
Like what yeah, he did. He gave a definite sign by raising, look, he was sitting there doing miracles and people didn't believe him, all right?
Yeah.
All right,
Yeah.
Look, if I started doing miracles here, they were literal, genuine miracles, what would your real response be? You'd be wondering, I want to know how he did that magic trick. Isn't that right? And we were in another culture where you didn't know about magic, you'd be wondering, okay, wait a minute, who's the demon that's doing this for him? And that's like literally what they were saying. He's not doing this by the power of God, he's doing it by a demon, all right? So even a definite sign, like I've been on the stage with atheists and they'll ask that question, I'll say, well look, imagine this happens. Imagine that God actually answers your prayer right now. He comes down with a gigantic sign. Yeah. There's like a light that comes down from heaven, it shines on you, and he says,
I am here.
Yeah, would you believe then? And the honest answer from all of them is, well, no. Because I would wonder, what? You know what they'd be wondering? How did you do the magic trick? Or how about this? Or was I mass hallucinating? Or were we all doing? I mean, there's so many other explanations. So even a direct sign from God is not enough. Well, and so what does Jesus say when they come to him and do this? He says that to a skeptical, unbelieving generation, he says to a wicked, but I'm going to say skeptical, I'm going to give one sign. The sign of Jonah. The sign of Jonah is he entered the belly of the earth, and then 3 days later came back. And this is before he died, right? And he says that basically the Queen of Sheba will look at this generation who got to see that, and she'll stand in judgment over them because she got far less just seeing Solomon's riches and still chose to believe.
Yep.
And he says the people of Nineveh will look at this generation and stand in judgment over them because they got far less. They didn't get to see all that, and then they still believed. So our situation is that we can go back and look back at all the clear evidence that is not just a private miracle where we can wonder about if we hallucinated it. It's not just something that happens in this room and doesn't affect everything. This is something that has physical evidence in the real world that was predicted by prophecy in the Great Isaiah scroll, that is in thousands of manuscripts building a historical story to the point that even atheists agree, well, I guess there really was a man named Jesus there. There's actually more than 10 other Messiah movements at the time. All of them ended in the death of their Messiah, and then either meant that they replaced the Messiah with a family member or just disbanded. The Jesus movement was heading the path of disbanding, and then somehow something happened that changed it.
Yep.
And we're all left trying to answer that grand question in history of what actually happened. Now, they say that they encountered the risen Lord, that he bodily rose from the dead. And that's what brought them together and had the most orthodox of all Jews starting to eat with Gentiles.
Yeah. And other facts as well on that too. Missing body. You had James, the brother of Jesus, who did not and was not a follower of his brother, became a believer, became a convert. Also, Paul. There's no explanation for why Paul, who was killing Christians, would switch team jerseys.
And his vision was interesting, right? Because it says that something, it's described in two different ways, but the people around him either heard or saw something at this vision happened. Right?
Yeah, it's powerful, the bright light.
And so that really confuses them because this is something happening in the real world they all inhabit, not merely in his head, his vision.
Right.
And so that's something happened. That's what they're saying happened. And if that's not what it is, what the heck was it? And there isn't really any good explanation. If you want a clear, definitive sign, well, the way how God makes himself known to the world is by raising this man, Jesus, from the dead. That's how we know. That's how I know that God exists, that he's good. He didn't come with a conquering army. He came humbly as a carpenter and laid down power and did good things when he was here. He's undeniably good. It's so much that even people don't believe he rose from the dead. They think he's a good teacher. And he wants to be known. This is craziness. I tell you, that's the craziest thing about it all. One thing you'll learn about science is that the earth is grand. The universe is grand, right? It's really big. That means that God is bigger than that, right? God made something that's big, but he's bigger than that thing that he made. And I think the most natural belief, this is why most atheists have a hard time believing in God if they're scientists, I'll tell you what. The part that's the most ridiculous about this is that something that created that thing that's that grand, why would he care a damn about us? That's actually one of the biggest troubling things I have about this whole thing here, because he doesn't need us. He could have left us to our own devices and gone away. He doesn't need us. This is core theology, right?
Yeah. This is say that God is all on his own, basically, and doesn't depend upon anything except his own self-existence.
He didn't make us because he was lonely. Right.
Yep.
He didn't need us, and he could do anything, yet he made a grand world that demonstrates just the obscene granditude of his power. And then in the middle of that, we are nothing. We're just like a tiny speck. And somehow God is mindful of us. He comes and incarnates as one of us. That's crazy to me. So I could come to the idea that from creation maybe that God exists, but somehow I find out from Jesus that God exists. He's not evil, but he's good. And it's not that he's distant, but he actually is close and wants to be known. And that's the one sign that he gives.
And let me say, too, to finish up on this question, God is not in the business of making sure everybody knows he exists. He's in the business of being in right relationship, right? So I'm a parent. Josh is a parent. We have kids. When we give our kids instructions, we expect them to behave. And when we're home, for the most part, they behave. But the question is, what happens when you're not home, when you leave that room? What are your kids going to act like? Are they going to act the way that you've instructed them to after you've left or not? And so I think when we think about this question, which is part of the objection, broadly speaking, is called divine hiddenness, right? That God is in the interest of forming creatures who are in a right relationship with him, who have the knowledge of salvation, and who are becoming more Christ-like. And so, for that reason, God's not interested in writing in the clouds, I'm here. Because we know, even from the biblical text, if he were to do that, if he were to be traveling as a pillar of fire or a pillar of cloud, that doesn't guarantee that people are going to still be in a right relationship with him. In fact, we know that the people still rebel, even in light of the miracles happening before them. So I don't think there is sufficient reason, as Josh also pointed out, that more evidence, more miracles would bring people to bend their knee and humble themselves before the Creator God.
So this is my favorite question that we've gotten, so I want to answer it in another way too, which I think is important from different angles. Is that okay?
Sure, yeah.
So I think the other thing too that's there too is I think one thing we find out about Jesus is that he has a different relationship with power than we do. We find out that God is not the type of God that tries to dominate us with power. He doesn't force us to do things for the most part. You know, that's just not how it works. I mean, he delays judgment for as long as possible. Like he could come there, kind of like, you know, the really annoying, you know, piano teacher with a ruler slap you on the wrist every time you do something wrong. But that's just not his nature. He's okay to release power and let you go do your thing.
And if you really read the Old Testament, you can see when his mercy and patience begins, and finally, generations upon generations upon generations later.
Yeah, so I think it's kind of like, you know, he has actually put a definitive sign. And the question is whether or not you want to engage with it. Now, I know what's going on in some people's minds, at least I imagine. So you're raising the church. Some of what we're saying just, maybe it's kind of those things that doesn't make sense. You're just saying that because you're a Christian or whatever. Or, you know, but I'm telling you, there's actually stuff out there in the real world, in secular textbooks anyways, even that points to this. But there's still that point of unbelief that we can have and that doubt. But I'll tell you, there's nothing in Scripture that commands us against doubt. Doubt is not a sin. It is not the opposite of faith.
Jesus doesn't scold Thomas when Thomas is wondering, hey, can I touch?
It has a really interesting relationship. It's similar to the relationship, I would say, between fear and courage. My son is 4 years old. He gets scared about things. I'm like, this is not a scary movie. But he can't handle any conflict in a movie that's physical. It just starts to scare him, right? But he's been starting to say, and I didn't even tell him to do this. I don't know where he got it from. This is what happens when you have babysitters and other things like that. He starts saying, you know, being scared is an opportunity to be brave. I'm like, wow, there's like some wisdom in this little kid. and he's right in that sense. And there's something similar going on with faith. But even more than that, when you look at what Jesus actually commands people to do, he doesn't command them not to doubt. What he says is he just asks them, invites them to follow him. And he doesn't tell them, believe this long list of things. He does things more like, well, what do you believe who I am? Who do you say that I am? It's a question, actually. He's not saying you need to believe that I'm this and you need to do that. He doesn't do that. All he says is, you know, leave your nets and follow me. And I think what we find out that this actually makes a great deal of sense if what's really he's about is relationships. If you follow Jesus, as you follow him the best you can, he'll make himself more known to you. If you're wondering actually about, you know, having that type of doubt, one thing to just wonder about is like, is there things that I already know I should be doing that I can follow him on? And I'll tell you, as you follow him, it becomes more real. He's able to do more. It's like dating too. You know, I could have sat there for quite a long time. Well, I guess I did, as friends with my wife before we started dating.
You were friend zoned, huh?
We weren't friend zoned. That's another story. But there's this point where, at some point you got to take a step forward and say, you want to go out on a date, even if we're not going to call it a date or whatever. And then there's this point where you have to decide, okay, so we've been dating for a while, we like each other, there's no reason not to. Maybe I really want to, whatever. Am I going to get engaged? And one thing that never happens when you're trying to make that decision about if you're going to get engaged to someone is certainty about what the future holds. You just don't know. And then there's this point where you decide, okay, are you going to actually say your vows to this person? And it's bizarre, frankly, to be in a church and actually say vows. Because you're making a promise about the future for the rest of your life, right? And you don't know what the future holds. Because you don't really know that person. You don't know them that well. You know them. They might be the person you know better than anyone else, but you really don't know them. And to be thinking you're making that commitment. And the thing about it is that as you walk forward, you get to know them better and better. And I think that type of covenantal relationship is what makes sense of this a lot.